Okay, so in part A, we ended the lecture at base strategy, proceeding on with public choice. One of the things I like about this is, it's public choice is definitely an economist way of looking at things. A lot of times when I'm teaching this in class, we start discussing different candidates or different people, and maybe trying to, explain where they might fit. One of the things that you might notice in when candidates are running for office is that they tend to put everything in a left, right, or liberal, conservative continuum. I hate those words liberal and conservative because liberal and conservative means different things to different people. But if we think of people on the left, let's say, as being quote unquote liberal and people on the right as being conservative, every issue, every candidate, everything is kind of put into this one continuum. Well, from my perspective, this has always seemed kind of foolish because I mean there's a lot of different ways of thinking about things. I mean you could think about ideas that are libertarian, meaning where people have as much freedom as they possibly can have, and then you could think of let's say systems or ideas that are authoritarian, where maybe the people in government want to take away people's freedom. I mean, this is just one other dimension you could add to it. There's many, many other dimensions, just like there's many flavors of ice cream besides vanilla and chocolate. There's no reason to think of everything as being just along one continuum. Why do politicians do this? Because again, they're trying to get more votes than somebody else, and so maybe they think the action all is all in the middle, and if they position themselves as being too far to the right or too far to the left, then they won't win election. All right, what about voting? Usually when I teach this class in a classroom setting, I ask students how many of you have voted in the last election or how many plan on voting. And, a pretty high percentage of people in general don't vote. So what are some of the reasons people don't vote? Some people would say that an election where the candidate who got more votes or won the majority of votes or more votes than the other candidate and didn't win would be something that would turn people off. In the 2016 election, I think it had just the opposite effect. I think a lot of people who weren't happy with Trump's election came out to vote in 2018, but in 2000 we had a similar event, and I think a lot of people were a little bit discouraged with the way our democratic system, works, our political system works. Another reason why a lot of people don't vote is they just feel that their vote isn't as important as the votes of other people or the votes of people who contribute with their money. So they feel that, oh, great, I go out and vote, but at the end of the day, the politicians, the candidates, the elected officials look at who's giving them the most money when they figure out what they want to implement. And then if we're economists, we always look at people as being rational. And so a rational person would engage in a cost-benefit analysis when it comes to doing anything. And voting would be no exception. They would look at the cost of voting versus the benefit that they stand to gain from voting. And if there really doesn't seem to be much benefit, then they might not vote for that reason. So these are some of the reasons that people don't vote. These are some other disputed elections, not including the 2000 election. And by disputed elections, I mean these are other examples where the candidate that got more votes did not win office because of the Electoral College. The Electoral College is something that is here as a result of a compromise made years ago, but it's something also that's not going to go away anytime soon. So we just have to deal with it. And in fact, I don't think it'll ever go away when you think about what is required to change the Electoral College. So we're kind of stuck with it, and this is not an aberration. I mean, this has happened. Not only this happened not only in 2016, where the candidate who won more votes didn't win. It happened in 2000, and then these are one, two, three, four other instances in U.S. history where the candidate that won more votes didn't become president. So that's it's not an aberration. It actually happens quite frequently. What about the costs and benefits of voting? So if you're a rational person and you're considering the costs and benefits of voting, and you were to, let's say, break it down into an equation, a mathematical formula, if you will, what you might do is you might look at the benefit of voting. You might come up with an equation for the benefit of voting, and then you might do the same thing for the cost. So one equation or one way of looking at the benefit of voting is to ask yourself, what is the probability that my one vote is going to affect the election, the outcome of the election? In some states, it's a very low probability. So, for instance, if you live like we do in California, it really doesn't, your vote, in a way, I don't mean to be negative, but your vote doesn't really matter all that much. We kind of know in today's deep blue California what the outcome is going to be. I mean, if you vote for the Democratic candidate, that's just one more vote for the Democratic candidate. If you vote for the Republican, it's probably not going to change the way California votes. You're one vote out of whatever 25 million eligible voters. All right, the other thing that you would look at in terms of the benefit is, let's say that there is some impact of my voting on the outcome. But then what additional direct benefit am I going to get if my candidate wins? And there again, it's probably not all that big, or you're not going to suffer that much of a direct loss if your candidate doesn't win. So if you're multiplying something that is very small by something that is also very small, there's not much of a benefit there. Now, what about the cost of voting? The cost of voting is pretty small too, and they're looking for ways of reducing the cost of voting as much as they can, but it's still hard to reduce the cost to something close to zero. I mean, you have to travel to the polls, you might have to wait in line, then you have to spend a certain amount of time voting. I mean, you could do what I did in the last election, and that was fill out my ballot, and then I walked it over to the polls and I dropped it in a drop box, but there's still a certain amount of time that you have to spend doing that. So, if you don't really see much of a benefit to voting, even a low cost would be something that would discourage you from doing that. This is an example. This is the electoral map, something I think we're used to seeing on election day. And one of the things I want to point out in the electoral map is that there are some states that reliably vote one way or another. So, for example, when we think of blue states, we think of the states, these are the states that the Democrats tend to win. They're on the coast and the Northeast, coast and Northeast, coast and Northeast. And then when you think of red states are in the middle, right? The red states are, what some people would refer to as flyover country. They're right in the middle. One state that does make a difference, one of the big states that does make a difference is Florida. If you live in Florida, because it's a swing state, some years it goes Republican, some years it goes Democrat. So, if you're living in a deep blue state like California or a deep red state like Texas, there's even really less benefit to voting because we know how things are going to turn out there. Now, on the other hand, if you lived in a state like Florida, it probably does pay for you to vote because they have quite a few electoral votes, and they could go either way. I mean, in 2000, it was 535 votes in Florida that swung the election towards Bush. So if you lived in that state, you probably would want to vote. In the 2016 election, and this is discouraging to some people, states that were considered reliably Democrat, blue states, turned for Trump. Now, did they turn for Trump by a big margin? And the answer is no. I mean, there were not that many votes that got Trump his victory in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. There were only about 77,000 votes. Now, Hillary Clinton got 2.8 million more votes than Donald Trump, but 4.2 of those came from California. Can you imagine if people in California didn't go out and vote in the 2016 election, then maybe her margin of victory in terms of the popular vote would have been a lot lower. But this again kind of gets to my point. If you live in some states, like let's say California or Texas, we know what the outcome is going to be, and your vote doesn't matter as much. But if in this particular election, 2016, if you lived in Michigan, Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania, then your vote really did mean quite a bit. So because the margin of victory in those states was so small. All right, here's another thing to consider. What about the Electoral College and who it favors? It actually is favors minorities, but we don't think of, but I'm not talking about minorities in the sense that we typically think of minorities. What I mean is it favors people in rural areas. Those are the minorities that are disproportionately represented by the Electoral College. So one of the things I did over here is I ranked the states by Electoral College votes from highest to lowest. And then what I did over here was I ranked them from lowest to highest, and I said, okay, how many states would we need to equal California's 55 electoral votes if we started with the smallest state and worked our way up? And so what you see is you need this many states over here to equal California's 55 electoral votes. What about Texas? Has 38. You need this many states to equal Texas's 38 electoral votes. What about Florida and New York, which both have 29 electoral votes? You need this many states to equal Florida or Texas or New York, and this many states to equal either Florida or New York. So what you can see is that people who live in relatively rural states, even though they have fewer electoral votes, tend to be overrepresented because of the Electoral College. Every state gets two senators and a governor, right? Whereas a state like California, even though we have 55 electoral votes, we're actually underrepresented compared to the size of the population. So the votes of people who live in rural areas, rural states, are are disproportionately heavier than the votes of people who live in more urban states like California or Texas or New York. All right, so one of the things that people try to do to get more voter participation is to lower the cost of voting. There's talk about having elections online, or there's all kinds of ways of making it easier for people to vote absentee. But one of the things I say is maybe having a high percentage of the people who don't vote isn't a bad thing. And a lot of people who are, let's say, sociologists or political scientists, or they would cringe at that idea. And the reason I say it's voter apathy, or a high degree of voter apathy, probably isn't a bad thing, is because if you think about, or if you know people from, let's say, other countries where the economic system, the country is not running well, people are always talking about politics. But when interact with people, let's say, in a country where the government runs pretty well, and, the economy is doing pretty well, then people move on and kind of think about other things. I mean, like, we've got 4th of July coming up. A lot of people are going to be going, let's say, to a 4th of July picnic or cookout or something like that. You're going to be interacting with other people. The chances that you're going to be talking about politics is probably a lot lower than it would be if you lived in a country where nothing worked well. So maybe having a reasonably well-run government, maybe having a reasonably good working economy, is quote unquote a deterrent to voting. It makes people more apathetic. But I don't think that that's a bad thing, because it just means that people live in a country that has good institutions, good economic system, and they don't have to worry about who's running the government, for the most part, right? So there's another thing in public choice theory called rational ignorance. And the idea behind rational ignorance is that it actually makes sense for somebody who knows that they're not going to participate in the electoral process not to inform themselves. I mean, if you wanted to be a responsible voter, one of the things that you'd have to do is inform yourself on the issue. So you'd have to spend a certain amount of time reading about the candidates, or maybe listening to their debate or where they stand on different issues. You'd have to take that information and process it and decide which candidate is you think is going to do a better job. And, that takes quite a bit of effort. Well, if on the other hand, you're not going to vote, you can avoid all that effort to begin with, and it doesn't make any difference. It's rational for people to be uninformed, to be ignorant, so to speak. So that's another leg in the stool for public choice theory. All right, what I'll do is I'll end it here, and we'll talk about a non-excludable good and the median voter.